Good morning. It is the customary practice of this committee to swear all witnesses who are to provide testimony. Can I please ask you to rise and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give to this subcommittee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect that all of the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. As you may notice, there's two small boxes in front of you. The practice here is to allow each witness 5 minutes. It'll show a green light while your testimony is being given. When that light turns yellow, it means you've got 1 minute to wrap up, and when it shows red, it requires you to stop speaking. What I'd like to do is just offer a brief introduction of our second panel of witnesses. Mr. Jordan Small is Acting Vice President, Network Operations for the United States Postal Service. Mr. John Waller is Director of the Office of Accountability and Compliance at the Postal Regulatory Commission. Mr. Philip Hare is Director of Physical Infrastructure Issues at the Government Accountability Office. Mr. Jerry Sarasal is Senior Vice President of the Government Affairs for the Direct Marketing Association. Mr. Arthur Sackler is the Executive Director of the National Postal Policy Council, and Mr. Michael Murphy is President of the Japs Olson Company, a printing and logistics company in St. Louis Park, Minnesota. Thank you all for your willingness to come forward and help the committee with its work. I now recognize Mr. Small for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I am here to talk to you about the steps the United States Postal Service has taken to make mail delivery as efficient as possible, our future operational plans to continue to improve delivery efficiency, and the Station and Branch Optimization Initiative. As you are well aware, the financial situation of the Postal Service is grave. It would be far worse were it not for the aggressive actions we have implemented. For example, since 2002, we have reduced costs by more than $1 billion annually. These efforts are particularly impressive when you consider that our delivery network continues to grow at a rate of about 1.2 new delivery points each year. In effect, we are delivering less mail to more addresses, which means we receive less revenue per address served. Cutting costs in delivery is particularly challenging because a substantial portion of delivery costs are fixed. Our carriers must deliver to each address whether there is one piece of mail or several. Within these constraints, we've embarked upon several initiatives that have improved delivery efficiency. The first initiative is the historic interim alternate route adjustment process that we have agreed to with the National Association of Letter Carriers, NALC, in 2008. This agreement enabled us to jointly conduct evaluations on some 93,000 routes and rapidly eliminate approximately 2,500 routes. Realizing that additional process improvements could be made, both parties jointly agreed to a new modified agreement in April 2009. The cost savings are estimated to eliminate approximately 25 million city delivery work hours, or some $1 billion over fiscal years 2009 and 2010. One consolidation activity that is underway is the review of station and branch locations in larger cities where we have a number of offices in close proximity. We began the review with some 3,200 locations that handled the most retail transactions and the most deliveries. We anticipate that out of these 3,200 locations, less than 1,000 will be considered as viable candidates to study further. Changes in mail processing technology have reduced the amount of space needed for carrier operations at many stations and branches. As a consequence, opportunities exist to consolidate carrier operations into fewer locations without affecting service. Many stations and branches were established at a time when first-class mail volume growth was robust. There were few means of alternate access to postal services, and virtually all retail revenue came from window transactions. Today, about 29% of retail revenue is generated through alternate access channels, such as our website, USPS.com, and automated postal centers. As local management undertakes the station and branch review, they will consider factors such as customer access, service standards, cost savings, impact on employees, environmental impact, real estate values, and long-term postal needs. We are taking all of these actions to use our resources wisely and position the Postal Service to survive this financial crisis while continuing top-quality service to the American public. Along this line, I ask Congress to support the Postal Service efforts to operate in a business-like manner as we make necessary decisions. As you know, the Postal Service has alerted stakeholders that mail volume levels can no longer sustain 6-day-a-week delivery. In prior testimony, the Postmaster General asked Congress to consider allowing a change in delivery frequency. At the same time, the Postmaster General tasked Postal Management with undertaking an internal review of 5-day delivery, so we have sufficient information and data to share with stakeholders. We are in the process of finalizing our study and have targeted the next months to share the results with our stakeholders and to begin a series of community outreach meetings. We plan to share this study with employees, customers, mailers, and members of Congress. Moreover, we will be asking the Postal Regulatory Commission for an advisory opinion. In closing, I would like to thank this subcommittee and the Oversight and Government Reform Committee for their action on H.R. 22. I hope in the near future the House will be able to quickly move retiree health benefit legislation. And finally, I would like to reiterate our commitment to continuing to make mail operations as efficient as possible while maintaining our excellent levels of service to the nation. Thank you, and I would be pleased to respond to your questions.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Waller, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lynch, Ranking Member Chavez, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on plans to adjust the retail and delivery networks.
Can I ask you to please pull that microphone a little
Sure.
closer to you? Yeah.
On July 2nd, the Postal Service requested a Commission advisory opinion on Postal Service station and branch optimization and consolidation initiative, the subject of this hearing. Docket N 2009-1 was quickly established and the public notified through the Federal Register, the Internet, and press releases. This morning, the Commission held a conference with persons interested in this consolidation to identify expectations for the docket and all procedural concerns. With this input, the Commission will shortly establish the agenda for examining the initiative and addressing all the issues. To ensure a wide range of public input, the Commission is considering holding hearings outside of the Washington, D.C. area. Now, what the Commission is being asked to do is determine if this consolidation initiative will generate changes in the nature of Postal Service on a nationwide basis, and if so, issue this advisory opinion that the consolidation process would result in closure decisions which will preserve levels of service consistent with the policies of postal legislation. In short, that the process will, in fact, achieve answers to a lot of the questions that members of the committee have raised that should be addressed. We're looking at that process to make sure that all these issues of community input, etc., are, in fact, taken or applied. Now, the process has been around for several years, and nearly 100 closures have occurred, some of these which have been addressed here. One will occur tomorrow in Washburn, Iowa. The new initiative will significantly accelerate that process. It began in May of this year with the pre-screening for discontinuance of all stations and branches that report to postmasters of 24 pay grade level or higher. This covers approximately 3,200 stations that are primarily located in urban and suburban areas. With this request, there was some certainty in the sense the guidelines were given that are supposed to be followed by the Postal Service, But they did not specify the number of offices to be discontinued, did not quantify the potential changes in the nature of any affected postal service, and has not estimated the expected financial savings. Questions are being asked in the Commission's docket that hopefully will clarify these facts and other aspects and criteria that will be used in the decision process. The Commission recognizes that under the PAA, the Postal Service has the flexibility and authority to make rational adjustments to its operations and networks to meet its business needs and create cost savings and efficiencies. This is especially important in these financial stressful times. But the Postal Service must be, by law, accountable and transparent to all postal customers, be sensitive to the needs of the community at the local level that it serves, and make changes in a strategic manner. In its most recent report on universal postal service and postal monopoly, the Commission found that access to postal service is a fundamental aspect of the universal service. A 2008 Commission-sponsored study found that households tend to utilize their local post office extensively. Over half the respondents reported that a member of their household visited a post office in the last 7 days, and an additional 25% reported visiting within the last 30 days. The Postal Service is obligated under past and current statutes to provide for thorough public notice and input into post office closure decision. The statute further gives the Commission authority to hear customer appeals of such decisions. The Commission has long held that a post office is any retail location staffed by Postal Service employees, which obviously includes stations and branches. Yet, notification of the public's right to appeal to the Commission is not part of the Postal Service closure process being examined. Questions are being submitted, have been submitted on this issue in the docket, and it's likely to receive a thorough review in the Commission docket. Now, the appeal process is simple. It is a letter submitted to the Commission by postal patrons in that area saying, we weren't notified, we weren't whatever it has to do with the procedures weren't followed. It is not a complex go-to-court procedure. I see I'm out of time, so I will conclude my oral statement and welcome the opportunity to answer any questions.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Hare, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Lynch, Ranking Member Chaffetz, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this hearing. Today, I will first provide updated information on the Postal Service's financial condition and outlook. Second, discuss GAO's decision to place the Postal Service's financial condition on our high-risk list this week. And third, discuss the need to restructure postal mail processing, retail, and delivery networks. The Postal Service's financial condition has deteriorated sharply over the past year. Mail volume is projected to decline 28 billion pieces this fiscal year, leading to some sobering statistics. A net loss of $7 billion, an increase in outstanding debt by the annual statutory limit of $3 billion, and an unprecedented $1 billion cash shortfall that will threaten the service's ability to make its mandated annual payment of $5.4 billion for future retiree health benefits. The outlook for fiscal year 2010 is even more challenging, as the service is projecting its outstanding debt to increase to $13.2 billion, just under its $15 billion statutory limit. The Postal Service urgently needs to restructure to address its current and long-term financial viability. This week, GAO added the Postal Service's financial condition to our list of high-risk areas needing attention by Congress and the executive branch. We have called for a broad restructuring plan that addresses key timeframes, and the plan should address both short and long-term challenges. These include realigning postal services to reflect changes in the use of mail, better aligning costs with revenues, optimizing its operations, networks, and workforce, increasing mail volumes and revenues, and retaining earnings to finance needed investments and repay debt. The restructuring plan should also include a strategy for optimizing its networks to eliminate growing excess capacity, maintenance backlogs, and reduce costs are urgently needed. Such action would also set the stage to reduce its workforce through attrition. In the next 4 years, a total of 300,000 employees are eligible or will be eligible for regular retirement, close to half of the career workforce. The Postal Service has taken some actions toward realigning its network, and I'd like to point out several of these. In the retail area, as discussed today, the service recently began a national initiative to consolidate some of its roughly 37,000 post offices, branches, and stations. Specifically, operations of over 3,200 retail stations and branches located in urban or suburban areas are being looked at for opportunities for consolidation, and decisions are expected starting this October. In terms of mail processing, the Postal Service has taken actions to close smaller facilities and consolidate other mail processing and transportation operations. However, only one of approximately 400 major processing facilities has been closed. With regard to delivery operations and the report being released today to this subcommittee, the Postal Service has over 350,000 carriers, and delivery costs represent the Postal Service's largest cost segment. There are two efforts underway to enhance delivery efficiency. One, realigning city routes is expected to generate about $1 billion in savings annually through the elimination of work hours and routes, reduced space needs, and more consistent delivery. Through realignment, about 4,300 routes have been eliminated to date, so there's some good progress. A second delivery-related initiative focuses on the $1.5 billion flat sequencing system that will automatically sort large mail pieces, such as catalogs and magazines, into delivery order. On routes covered by the new machines, city carriers, on average, will manually sort nearly 500 fewer flat-sized pieces of mail each day, allowing them to spend more time delivering mail. In closing, while we recognize that the Postal Service will face resistance in realigning its networks on several fronts, we believe broad restructuring is imperative to help the Postal Service achieve sustainable financial viability. For realignment to succeed, the Postal Service must use a transparent process that's consistently applied, engage with unions, management associations, the mailing industry, and political leaders. And it must also demonstrate results. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my prepared statement, and I'm pleased to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Sackler, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to you, Ranking Member Chaffetz, and members of the subcommittee. The National Postal Policy Council greatly appreciates the opportunity to present its views on the Station and Branch Initiative. In a nutshell, our members support this initiative to help address the current financial contraction facing USPS and in the larger context of providing the Postmaster General and his team true flexibility to manage. NPPC is the trade association for large business users of letter mail, primarily in first class. Before the downturn, our approximately 30 members collectively mailed about 39 billion pieces and contributed some $9.5 billion in postage every year. At the outset, let me say that the acceptance of the need for meaningful change in the postal system has been growing in recent days. Through no fault of its talented management team or its truly dedicated working men and women, the Postal Service is experiencing a catastrophic decline in volume that won't come back robustly and for years. Grappling with the thorny issues of managing USPS to its actual volume has become essential for preserving a bedrock institution still essential to commerce and communications in the United States in the 21st century. So as one aspect of change, we're pleased to be able to discuss this initiative, for it is necessary not only in the short term but in the longer term. NPPC has not undertaken a scientific survey of its members, but the consensus view is that when the economy comes back, mail will not follow. There should be some recovery in standard, but first class, which is the most lucrative for the Postal Service, as you know, will continue its decline, albeit at a slower rate. We support the initiative because the current system of post offices and other facilities grew up haphazardly with population growth and shifts. An orderly rethinking of the system is long overdue, and efficiencies in services are very likely to be obtained. Second, the initiative will help streamline a system built for far more mail volume than it has or is likely to have for the foreseeable future. Third, a carefully planned and thought-through effort to close or consolidate facilities should yield some cost savings. Fourth, the closings and consolidations will occur largely, if not exclusively, in metropolitan jurisdictions. This should lead, we hope, to a less emotional public reaction than in some smaller communities, and given that there are other post offices or facilities nearby, there should be continued easy access for the public. Fifth, and most importantly, NPPC believes that the Postmaster General and his team need to have as much flexibility to manage the system as possible. to run it like a business. Over this decade, Postmaster General Potter, Deputy PMG Donahue, and their management team have demonstrated tremendous ability to drive costs out of the system. They've done so while improving service and reducing the workforce without alienating the unions and management associations. In fact, it has been an intense cooperative effort. Because of that outstanding track record, the senior postal management team should be granted broad latitude to manage the system, including optimizing stations and branches. The urgency animating this plan and much else from USPS is the daunting financial challenge it confronts. You know very well that it's projecting 175 billion pieces of mail this year, off some 37 billion from its peak just 2 short years ago, with $13 billion drop in revenues. So, Mr. Chairman, MPPC is grateful to you, Ranking Member Chaffetz, Chairman Towns, Ranking Member Issa, and the members of the full committee for rapidly reporting out H.R. 22. We're particularly appreciative of the prime sponsors, Messrs. McHugh and Davis. We urge H.R. 22's passage by the entire House at the earliest opportunity. But regrettably, USPS is going to need further financial attention to right itself. When H.R. 22 was introduced last winter, it seemed to give USPS enough relief. Unfortunately, the accelerating loss of volume since has simply overwhelmed the relief offered through H.R. 22. We don't pretend to have the solution. Many possibilities have been raised in this subcommittee and elsewhere. In general, we believe that any long-term solution should be balanced and call on all postal stakeholders to make equivalent sacrifices to maintain the system. However, we feel constrained to note that one possibility, an exigent rate increase, would be profoundly counterproductive. We know neither the Postal Service nor members of Congress have called for such an increase, but others in the postal community have raised it. So let us be direct. Mailers simply cannot afford an increase. They are doing everything they can to restrain costs as their own businesses severely decline in this recession. The number of layoffs in the postal-based industries is at minimum in the hundreds of thousands. There are also mergers and bankruptcies. Budgets for all items in these industries, very much including postal, are under tremendous pressure. Even a small increase may have a significant adverse reaction, but an increase large enough to address USPS losses would virtually guarantee a large volume drain. Postal budgets simply would not stretch to meet higher prices. Thank you once again for this opportunity to present our views. I'll be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Sirasala, you are now recognized for 5 minutes. Am I pronouncing your name correctly, sir?
Close enough. Sirasal. It's all right.
Sirasal.
That's
okay.
fine. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, the subcommittee, for giving us the opportunity to be here. DMA wants to thank you, Mr. Chairman, the subcommittee, and the entire committee for H.R. 22. We all need a postal service, a financially viable one, and the short-term, sadly it's now short-term help that H.R. 22 gives is imperative. The financial condition of the Postal Service is precarious, and sadly it's not improving at this point in time. Postal Service has to grow volume. It has to become more efficient. But at the same time, mailers are facing the same financial conditions. The 22% drop in standard mail advertising reflects that fact. As the economy comes back, some of this mail will come back, but sadly, we don't think all of it will come back. And mailers cannot shoulder another rate increase. As a matter of fact, that rate increase may in fact prove fatal, both for it and the Postal Service. We therefore support the summer sale the Postal Service has put together in trying to increase mail volume. We hope that this will be duplicated in the future with more advance notice and will be taken greater advantage of to try and get mail back into the system. Looking on the cost side, we have to do, everything has to be on the table. As our group, we're mailers, we're willing to talk about everything to try and reduce costs. The things that you're looking at here today, looking at the delivery route adjustments, they've been going on for my entire lifetime. My time up here as an employee in the House, one of the complaints that I always had at the Committee on Post Office and Civil Service was my mail is not coming at the same time as it used to. Complaints from businesses as well as individuals, and that is in fact has happened all the time as the demographics, the geographic distribution of the American population has changed. Right now, we have to look at it from the point of view of decreased volume, decreased revenue to afford the route system that we currently have. And the good thing is that the Postal Service is working with the NALC on looking at these route adjustments. But these have been happening before. Sadly, the economic times are forcing this to happen more rapidly at this point in time. But I think, from our view, the Postal Service is doing the right thing and working with their employee groups to try to get this right. Now, it hurts some of our members because they're not going to get the mail at the same time they received it before. But that's one of the things, is we're all working together to try and keep the Postal Service strong and viable. Looking at the stations and branches, it's our understanding that the Postal Service is looking at not at rural offices. They are looking at the proximity of other stations and branches to the one that they're thinking about closing, looking at the retail trends at that branch, looking at the impact on the employees, the impact on the community, which is very important. They're looking at the savings, the net savings. If you close this facility and you have to move employees and the carriers come out from there, is there more time? The net savings has to be there. And then the ability of other stations and branches to handle the traffic that it's being closed. So those are things, I think the setup that the Postal Service has put together, they're looking at the right things. They're asking the correct questions. And there's always the point of a PRC, a Postal Regulatory Commission appeal. As the Postal Rate Commission in 2006, the PRC did, in an opinion, did say that they could, if this closed the only postal retail service in a community, even if it wasn't specifically a post office with a postmaster, but a station and branch, that they had jurisdiction. Not everyone agrees, but that ability stays. And this effort by the Postal Service doesn't change that factor. We all need the Postal Service, and we all have to chip in. All of us have to chip in for its survival. And we appreciate the fact that you're aware of that, you're looking at that, and we're here to try and help and do our part as well. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Murphy, did I pronounce your name correctly?
Yes, yes.
It's because I have a whole precinct of Murphys back home. One precinct, everybody's named Murphy. You're recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for allowing me an opportunity to appear before you today to discuss some of the challenges facing the mailing industry and the Postal Service. My name is Michael Murphy. I am the president of Japs Olson Company, located in St. Louis Park, Minnesota. We are a family business that has been in operation for more than 100 years. Our business is printing and mailing. We will produce more than 600 million pieces of mail this year for all types of customers across the country. I am here today also as chairman of the board of the Mailing and Fulfillment Service Association. MFSA is the only association solely representing the mailing industry. We have approximately 600 members, which are comprised of printers, mailing service providers, product fulfillment companies, as well as suppliers to the trade. Needless to say, the Postal Service is a vital partner in our businesses. Therefore, we believe it is important that the Postal Service have the complete support of Congress to manage its networks efficiently and to scale its infrastructure in proportion to its business needs. Our company and MFSA members urge the Congress to allow the leaders of the Postal Service to do their jobs and to manage their public institution with the same goal of efficiency as that of private industry. The Postal Service's Board of Governors, the Postmaster General, and the agency's senior executives must be given the latitude to make the decisions necessary to return the postal system to profitability. Those decisions include the necessary measures that are essential to control cost and, in turn, postage rate control. We hear some suggest that many of the messages carried by the Postal Service can be diverted to electronic distribution. To the extent that this is true, it could result in hundreds of thousands of jobs lost in the industries that depend on this distribution system. In just the current recession, thousands of jobs have already been lost in the supply chain that relies on the mail. Our association's experience over the past 18 months suggests that from just those companies that have gone out of business, we have lost 1,500 jobs. Extrapolating that to the industry as a whole, we believe that the industry has lost no less than 15,000 permanent jobs during that same period. Even with the challenges we have been facing, there are still more than 8 million people whose employment is affected by the postal system. We owe it to these people to ensure that the postal system is on firm financial footing and will be a viable public service in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I yield myself 5 minutes. May I start with Mr. Small? What I would like to avoid is the situation that we had with the AMPs, what is it, the mail processing, what's that? Area mail processing facilities, all these acronyms. We had a situation with the mail handlers out in Atlanta, I think it was, where they identified one of their stations for closure, one of these AMPs, and they gave the employees the opportunity to relocate to Oklahoma City as part of that closure. And obviously that sent the employees to the roof. And I don't think it was a thoughtful process. And while I admit that the finances here are very grave, as a number of you have pointed out, there is the need, nevertheless, to conduct ourselves with I think, a thoughtful approach to this consolidation, and do it in a way that causes the least bit of disruption, and with all respect to these communities and to the employees that are affected. And I think it's possible. I think, we've got 37,000 post offices out there, and I'm sure that there are some that are close to each other, and that we can work this out. But I have to ask you, what are the criteria that you're making these decisions? You've got, what, 3,200 that you've identified?
Correct.
And there are probably, you think there's probably 1,000 out there, or a little less than 1,000 that might actually be eligible for closure?
Less than 1,000 that require further review.
Okay, well, I know that the rural post offices are off the list, because if you close one of those, you got somebody driving 200 miles to a post office, and I understand that. So we've got a hold harmless provision for those post offices that says, even though they're not making enough money to sustain themselves, we're going to leave them in there because we've got to provide essential services. Yet you have another post office in an urban area, maybe a poor minority area in an inner city that's it's not generating enough revenue to sustain itself either, and we're going to close that. And I think Mr. Cirrus's testimony was on that point. What are you using as the standard here? What are the criteria? Can we figure that out? You got that laid out somewhere? With 37,000 facilities here, we would like the opportunity to be able to explain to our constituents what the process was. It needs to be transparent. It needs to be fair. It needs to be consistent. And hopefully it'll make sense. It'll make sense economically, consistent with your goals, while at the same time providing adequate access. So what are the factors you look at in determining whether somebody's eligible on the 3,200 list? How are they determined?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as I stated and you stated, we're looking at now less than 1,000 offices, because out of the 3,200, the 2,200 were immediately eliminated for consideration for various reasons, which I'll go into as part of the criteria. Part of the criteria is, what is the proximity of nearest services? What are the mailing habits and consuming habits of the American public with the Postal Service within those areas? We've found that we've seen close to 5% less activity at our retail units, while the percent of the American public going to our website at USPS.com has increased. Customers also go to various other means of alternate access. So we look at the proximity of the nearest services. We look at, is there adequate parking at the nearest services? We look at the mailing habits of the public in that area where a station and branch is being served.
Okay. Well, I think my time is just about expired, so rather than, I'll do a follow-up later on, maybe in the second round. Chairman, recognize the gentleman from Utah.
Thank you. I appreciate you all for being here and sharing your comments and expertise. I'd like to start with the GAO, if I could. How many agencies or government entities are currently on the high-risk list? I'm just trying to get a perspective.
29, sir.
29?
29, yes.
And at one point, the Postal Service was taken off the high-risk list.
That's correct, yes.
And so just to highlight again, I know you talked about this in your testimony, but the top reasons on why the urgency, I think I understand the financial needs, but is there something else above and beyond the financial peril that they're in?
Well, there are two different ways we look at the high-risk list. One, and the one we used with regard to the Postal Service, is areas or agencies that we think are in need of broad transformation. So in this case, the Postal Service met that criteria. I think the other thing is we tracked the financial condition over the past year, and we looked at those numbers deteriorating. That made the case more compelling. You add in the mail volume drop, and it suggests that a broad look at this was needed, and we therefore made that decision.
I'd like to hear from about the 5-day delivery. Is that something, Mr. Small, Mr. Waller, that has definitively been decided? Your thinking about it? Is that something that you think would happen week in, week out?
We haven't concluded the study. We should be finished with the study in the next couple of months, but
Mr. Small, is your microphone on?
yes, sorry,
Maybe
I'm a little closer.
Just a little closer.
We have yet to complete the study. The study should be completed shortly, and we view it as the only viable option right now that will.
Can you give me a specific date?
I don't have a specific date, but I'll provide one for the record.
That would be great. And who's participating in that study? I mean, we have a lot of organizations, unions, whatnot, that are here. Who is participating, or more importantly, not participating in the input that will go into that study?
We're working with the various stakeholders to get their feedback, our customers, the PRC, and also the unions. We've talked to the unions about these tough issues associated with 5-day delivery, members of Congress. So we're making sure that we talk with all of our stakeholders to understand what potential issues they would have by going to 5-day delivery.
And those of you that represent the use of the Postal Service from more of a customer standpoint, can you give me, maybe starting with Mr. Murphy, your perspective on what would happen with 5-day delivery as opposed to 6?
Well, we would support 5-day delivery in the sense that it is a big area to control cost, and we feel that that is very, very important overall for the system to be pegged to what's happening in the marketplace. Okay. So would rather not have it, but it is one of those items that's on the table and will be valuable.
Our membership is somewhat divided. Some of them
5.5-day delivery. So.
Yeah, right. Some of them 5-day delivery would not be a major impact. Others, and the Postal Service is talking about Saturday delivery is very important for them. But I think all of them are looking at what are the trade-offs. If the savings from 5-day delivery, what other things are going to happen to try and improve the Postal Service? One of the things we have to worry about is dramatic reduction in service and raising rates. That really doesn't come out to a very good solution. So those are things that we're looking at. We're waiting to take a look at an entire plan, and we're hoping to see what the study the Postal Service comes up with is.
Mr. Sack.
Mr. Chaffetz, we're in a similar position to Jerry's members. We're not so much divided. I think the sentiment generally is we wouldn't want to do this. We need to have 6 days of delivery, but again, what are the trade-offs? How do you get to a position where you resolve the Postal Service's difficulties? So as part of a larger solution, I think it could be something that could be seriously entertained. And it would be, if it were done, it would be a sacrifice. Let me just give you one example. We have quite a few banks and financial institutions in our group. And for them, remittances flowing 7 days a week are vital, but it's not just that. The longer, if there's a day of delivery that is taken out, then it takes longer for bills to get there in the first place. There are changes to float and therefore to business practices, to financial viability, to responsibilities to shareholders, and so forth. It's not an uncomplicated situation. So our view is it's got to be part, if it's done, part of a larger, long-term solution.
Thank you. I see my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes, who seeks recognition? The Chair recognizes the gentlelady from District of Columbia, Ms. Holmes Norton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, let me go to get something clarified. Mr. Herr, the GAO report with this title could have been written, at least this title, any time in the last, I don't know, 10, you name it, years. Broader restructuring needed to address deteriorating finances. Why was the Postal Service taken off the high-risk list in 2007, please?
There a couple things factored into that. At that point, the Postal Service didn't have outstanding debt. The other thing is Congress had taken action to pass the PIA Act, and we thought that that would lay some of the groundwork going forward.
But it would have still needed across-the-board restructuring, would it not?
Well, the other thing is mail volumes have dropped precipitously since that point. I mean, we've seen just this year.
But of course, that was predictable in 2007 as well. I ask this question because the only thing I can think of that is worse than collapse of the constitutionally mandated Postal Service is for it to do what it is doing now, falling apart piecemeal before our very eyes. And when that happens, it's the element of surprise and clear absence of planning. My question really goes, I suppose, Mr. Small, initially, here we're still talking about 5-day week, even though almost 70% of the American people say that they would favor a 5-day week. We're still talking about it. We've been talking about it now for a very long time. I noted in your testimony you talked about flat sequencing, indicating the Postal Service did understand that sometimes you have to invest in order to, if I may use the word, right size. Only now are we talking about consolidation in any kind of meaningful way. Is there a plan for right-sizing the Postal Service so that we do not come to these hearings to hear of various economies and efficiencies that one would expect from a business that has to do what many have to do now, which is simply take some efficiencies pending something. I don't know what's pending here except collapse, and I don't hear that there is a right-sizing plan of any kind that the Postal Service is engaged in, seeing all the handwriting on the wall that I think even the average American can see right now. What right-sizing plan do you have or do you intend?
Well, I think if you look at the cost-cutting and efficiency gains that we've employed this year, we're on track to save over $6.1 billion. The major components of future right-sizing of the network is the big issue is to provide significant systemic response to the problem, and that would be 5-day delivery. Second issue, we've undertaken the transformation of our BMC network.
Are you moving toward erasing deficit, Mr. Small?
By
so that you can operate the Postal Service without a deficit inasmuch as the Treasury is not open to you?
The network change and the changes in improvements in efficiencies are working towards reducing the deficit.
Could I ask if any of you know what your competitors, the private post offices, what kind of shape they're in? The FedExes, the UPS. UPS might be a good example because it's a union company. you're competing with these various privatized version of much of what you do. They don't deliver the mail, but you have gotten into their business. Have you looked at those businesses to see how your competitors are faring and whether or not there's anything they're doing that you could benefit from? Yes, sir. Yes,
okay.
sir.
Yes, we're in constant communication with our competitors. And matter of fact, we have ventures with our competitors, such as FedEx, with using their air network to fly our product. Also, both FedEx and UPS use us as their last mile for many of their products.
Yeah, I think we need to hear more about that in terms of right-sizing the postal office. Now, look, I'm going to ask you a question. This is not a NIMBY question. I will not object. And members have to understand that if you are more transparent about it and if it's part of right-sizing, we have to be prepared to defend what you have to do with respect to postal services. Having said that, are there any post offices in the District of Columbia or postal stations under review for closing? You see, that's something that any member ought to be able to ask and get an answer to.
I believe that a list was submitted to this committee yesterday. Offhand, I couldn't personally tell you if there are or not stations in the District of Columbia, but I'd be happy to provide you with a copy for the record.
I'd appreciate it, and this is what I think needs to happen. Postal Service is just too slow. You're going to have to reach out to communities. You're going to have to get feedback. You're going to have to hear all the protests. Transparency begets protest. You are moving so slow that I think that you are not ahead of the decline and, forgive me, fall of the Postal Service unless you can hasten this process with the kind of right-sizing that puts it all before us so we know what has to be done. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Just to clarify, we did get the list yesterday. I noticed there are 6 Washington, D.C. Post offices that have been identified for full study. And there are, I noticed in my district there are 3 suburban post offices that have been identified with full study as well. Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Virginia, Mr. Conley.
I thank the Chair. Mr. Hare, is there some concern, should there be some concern, that with the best of intentions, some of the cost-cutting measures being contemplated or undertaken could prove to be counterproductive? When I listen to some of the measures we're looking at, I'm struck by the parallel with the newspaper industry. Declining advertising accelerated in the recession, some of which won't come back. Advertising gravitating toward online newspapers that are free, but not enough to make it a viable business model, at least not yet. Giving away newspapers free at metro stations and other places because your competition does, further accelerating the loss of paid subscribers, because why would I pay for a newspaper I cannot get for free? Consolidating offices, closing bureaus, downsizing constantly, and yet it doesn't seem to have righted the ship of state, if you will. In the case of some of the actions being contemplated, we're looking at consolidation so there are fewer points of entry in the system, which may be a very prudent thing to do, but I'm struck that the competition has points of entry all over the place. Not full offices necessarily, but very convenient drop-off points if I want to participate in their system. Going to 5 days, not 6, but I think that the competition is available for 6 if I want to pay for it. Raising fees, as has been stated by Mr. Sackler, there's probably some upper limit to how much we can get away with that without making ourselves less viable and driving away even more customers. So I'm just wondering, there's no implicit criticism necessarily of the steps, but have we looked at the risk of unintended consequences by way of counterproductivity with these cost-cutting measures?
Congressman Conley, thanks for that question. It's an interesting point. In looking at this, one of the things we're suggesting is that the Postal Service needs to articulate the plan that talks about how it can take action. But part of that, in terms of, you mentioned, say, differing entry points for mail. That's why it would be important to coordinate with the folks in the mailing industry about how that would roll out so it could be done in a way that people understand what that change will, what it would entail. The Postal Regulatory Commission may have a role in terms of reviewing some of those cases as well. There are a lot of different pieces that go into maintaining universal service throughout the country. I mean, I understand that some distribution centers from Maine to Arizona, from Florida to Alaska, to do that, you would require a network of processing facilities. In terms of the retail side, one of the things that we noticed, there's 37,000 facilities, but 30% of the retail revenue is not coming through post offices. It's coming from alternatives, grocery store sales, things of that nature. In talking with folks at the Postal Service about this retail initiative, one of the things I was struck by is that there's somewhat of a qualitative assessment at the community level, trying to ensure that if there's a senior citizen community or groups that are being served, that would be factored into that decision making. So there are trade-offs, but the other side of it is that there is also a great decline in the amount of mail going through the system. And so one of the bedrock principles that the Postal Service has been operating under is being self-sustaining. So factoring those things into consideration and these changes, we think a plan, a restructuring plan, Congress, the administration looking at that would be an important step.
A couple of things I'd like to say. First, in regards to the list of post office stations and branches under consideration, at the meeting I mentioned this morning that occurred at the Commission, the Postal Service promised to give a list of the 677 facilities that are going to be studied. When they file that, that'll go up on the prc.gov website immediately, and that'll be available to all people in the country through that. To look at who's and where, etc. This issue of looking at it as a whole thing is also of concern as we look at a process like this. Last time we did an advisory opinion, it was on the processing facilities and the Postal Service's plan for looking at that, and found quite a few problems that existed in the planning process at not looking at how many real savings were going to be achieved through that process and what backlashes might occur in productivity. Secondly, in the work the Commission has done so far, looking at small post, or not small post, the route reduction from 6-day to 5-day, one of the things the Commission included in its analysis was an estimate of the drop in volume that might occur, and that's about $600 million impact. So looking at all these issues and not looking at it too narrowly is extremely important.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my time is up, and I would just say that if Mr. Clay were still here, I know he'd want to ask that going beyond short-term measures to return ourselves to solvency, what's the long-term business model we're confident is viable? But of course, Mr. Clay is not here to ask that.
Maybe Mr. Davis wants to ask that question, but the Chair recognizes the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me thank you for calling the hearing. And I also want to thank all of the witnesses for appearing. I think that some of us have known pretty much that we were going to be at this juncture, probably for quite some time. I think we were hoping against hope that we would not really get to this point. And so let me just say, first of all, Mr. Small, I don't envy Mr. Potter and yourself and other members of the staff and the Board of Governors as you try and wrestle with this problem and figure out what's the fairest, most effective, most efficient way of making sure that our Postal Service remains solvent, recognizing the economics and the status of our economy. My question is, I know that there's the study underway relative to 5-day delivery. What other cost-cutting proposals did you consider before reaching the point of sort of settling on the reorganization of facilities plan?
I think if you look at our cost-cutting efforts and what's been able to enable us to achieve $6.1 billion this year in cost savings, we've reduced overtime, we've minimized the use of the supplemental temporary workforce, we've adjusted routes both city and rural, we've currently implemented a network structure change transforming the bulk mail centers into network distribution centers, consolidating package and standard operations to realize economies of scale and efficiency in processing and reduce redundancies in transportation. We've also embarked upon, as was referred to before, the AMP effort, where we have consolidated outgoing operations to better utilize equipment in certain plants, as well as compressed tours to, again, take advantage of the unprecedented drop-off in volume and being able to provide a more efficient means of utilizing our equipment within our plants.
So one could really say that you're down to the point where you don't have many options left. You don't have many other places to go. Or I guess we'd say you're between a rock and the hard place.
The last big option is unfortunately the need to go from 6 to 5-day delivery. That's the one big piece out there that would add to helping us maintain liquidity and be viable.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hur, let me ask you, I know that GAO has taken the position, before now, time and time again, that there were some other cost savings, cost-cutting approaches that the Postal Service perhaps could have been taken sometime before now. How do you feel in relationship to what they have done and the plan that they've put together?
I think at this point we've looking over the past year, I mean, some of the low-hanging fruit in terms of overtime and things like that have been taken into consideration. The route adjustment process that Mr. Small referenced, we just have a report that came out today that talks about that initiative, and I think if volumes continue to decline, there will be additional opportunities there. We still believe that there are opportunities in terms of the broader facilities. We talk about that in terms of the processing network. We know there's some consolidation studies that are still underway, but we think that this broader plan that's referenced in our high-risk report would be a next starting point to help achieve some consensus about where this might go going forward, sir.
My time is about to expire, but let me ask you, Mr. Small, did the Postal Service apply for any of the economic stimulus money?
No.
Is there a reason that you didn't?
I think that question would be better answered, or is outside of my scope of being able to answer that question.
All right, I understand that, and thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Utah for 5 minutes.
And the gentleman brings up a great point about here we're spending all these $1 trillion, and here we have a constitutionally mandated service that truly does benefit and service every single American. It does seem that it would be appropriate that while I would have voted and have voted against the stimulus money, that some of those monies should have been allocated to this service, which not only benefits individuals but businesses alike. And I think we should explore that a little bit more if there's opportunities moving forward. A question for you about the 3,200 or so post offices that are closed. What's the estimated savings by doing that?
This is a bottom-up approach, and since we've reduced and we're continuing to the next stage beyond the preliminary study with the less than 1,000 offices that we're going to
But do you have some sort of range of dollars?
No, we won't know until the beginning of October when we continue.
But the other 2,000 or so, you don't know, have any understanding what?
The whole cost center, if you look at the entire cost center of those 3,200 offices, that includes carrier operations, which of course would not be eliminated, rent, ownership of facilities, operations. That whole cost center is worth $16 billion.
So if you break out the labor component, certainly there's got to be some estimation of what the number is there not?
Well, I think the reason why we cannot give you an estimate until October is because we have not taken a cookie-cutter approach or set targets for how many would need to be eliminated. And only those that are in close proximity, provide ready access to the community would be under consideration, and we just don't know that number until the study is fully completed.
And have you all taken a position on the bill, H.R. 658, that we heard testimony in Panel 1 on?
Yes, and we don't agree with it.
And why not?
Due to our dire financial deteriorating situation, we've had this process in place with stations and branches for 40 years that seems to work. We have to be able to react quickly and rapidly to this financial situation.
So if you gave them an extra 30 days, you think that would be unacceptable?
I believe that the rules as they're currently applied are adequate.
Mr. Hurt, is there anything that you can add to what I was asking about previously about the elimination of some of these facilities? Is there any cost estimates? There are several proposals that are floating around the Postal Service, 5-day delivery, elimination of, the consolidation of routes, those types of things. Has the GAO looked at what is realistic in terms of actual cost savings?
We've seen the two estimates that have been provided. The other thing that we've called for in prior testimony before this committee is that a study should be done and it should be made public so people can see and understand what those assumptions are. I know the PRC has one estimate for what 5-day delivery would result in, about $2 billion. John, is that correct? 1.9, and the estimate from the Postal Service was significantly higher, about $3.5 billion. So once that comes out, we're very interested in taking a hard look at that, and I would be happy to work with the committee on that if that would be of help.
Okay.
But to your other question, we also ask about, and one thing that's been a bit of a source of frustration is getting estimates about what savings might be achieved. We have noted in prior reports on the retail network that there's a lot of places that are in disrepair, and so there's real maintenance backlogs. So we think there could be cost savings there as well. It's not just moving folks, but there's also some of these places that have really fallen into neglect.
Mr. Waller, it looked like you wanted to comment on that.
Yes, this issue is one that is already we're starting to push on in the docket, is what are the exact savings and can you bound it in some way? If you look at the way costs are accounted for in the Postal Service, retail clerks, which is what we're talking about here, and then if you add on all the extra costs, the space they take up and stuff like that, we're only talking about $4.1 billion for all post offices, all stations and branches. This is not a big cost item. So if you narrow it down just to station and branches, which I think it's very important that come out in this hearing that the Commission has underway, to narrow it down, what is really the even potential savings?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time's up. I would just say that while we continue to talk about cuts and elimination, and we also obviously need to look at relevancy and marketing and how we make the post office more relevant in the services. I think one of the things that we need to spend more time on is the cross functionality that can happen. I was very pleased that you co-signed with me the potential of the Postal Service helping to conduct and do the enumeration portion of the census. I think there are other ideas that we can do that can inject some cash sooner rather than later and make the Postal Service, again, increasingly relevant in people's lives. And we have such great real estate facilities, people. I mean, all these assets are in place, and yet I don't believe our other elements within our own federal government are paying attention to those. It's so frustrating when you have the federal government utilizing services outside when we have these services internally. And so I think we need to continue to explore that, and particularly the timing with the census, which I think would be a great asset. And I'll yield back the remainder of my excess time. Thank you.
Let me ask, I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes. Let me ask Mr. Small a hypothetical situation. We talked earlier about this desire to look at going from 6 to 5-day delivery. As you know, the Appropriations Committee, the subcommittee, has again mandated that we retain 6-day delivery. But let's just entertain it hypothetically. Suppose I had a brother-in-law that delivered mail on Saturdays right now, a letter carrier. What happens? What happens to the letter carrier, he and others, when we shift to a 5-day delivery cycle?
We certainly understand that change is difficult and are aware of changes that would occur with our employees. That assignment would basically be eliminated. The way carriers are structured, we deliver for 6 days a week. You have a regular carrier on a route for 5 of the 6 days, and then you have a carrier who performs the regular carrier's duties on their day off. We have a negotiated agreement with the National Association of Letter Carriers for a supplemental workforce of 15,000 transitional employees, plus an annual attrition rate of approximately 11,000 carriers a year. We're very proud of the fact that we have never had to lay employees off, and that we will continue to try to place any employee that is affected. But there is a cushion available through the temporary workforce and attrition to try to ensure that there is not a dramatic effect on our employees.
So are you saying that there's no layoffs, or what are you saying here?
I can't say or guarantee that there wouldn't be layoffs. If we look at it, or the time frame by which we would have to get this done, there's a possibility that we will be able to assume some of the affected employees through the attrition of 11,000 carriers, and also the 15,000 that are temporary employees.
Is there a hiring freeze right now?
Yes.
Okay, let me ask you, going back to these the consolidation of facilities. I know that we own, the Postal Service owns some buildings, and then in other cases we actually rent, or we have long-term leases and options and whatnot. When you're looking at a potential closure, and I know, representing a city with fairly high rental space downtown, those expenses to maintain facilities like that of any considerable size, it's a pretty expensive option. Do you have a way of balancing whether or not you close a facility based upon whether it is post office owned or leased?
I think it would be determined by which facility can absorb the gaining facility. We have to weigh the balance, the customer input and effect, access and services provided. I could think about, and I know you mentioned it on Fox News yesterday, offices that are close, a block away from each other. In my former district, I could think of 3 examples right now where we had stations, 3 groupings of stations within a block of each other. Those are the type of facilities we would look at, and we'd have to determine if 2 facilities were consolidated into one, which facility had the adequate space, which facility had the adequate parking, and then make the determination based on whether it's a lease or an owned facility.
Okay, and looking ahead, you know, I think there's a system in Finland, Sweden. There's actually it's actually being replicated here in the United States. I think they call them Zoom boxes or something like that, where a person can go online and see their mail, and they see what's potentially could be delivered, and if they want to toss it, if they want it delivered, they can click on it. And if they don't want it, if it's junk mail, they can get rid of it by clicking on it and put it in the trash can. That will greatly reduce the volume of mail because people won't have to get their junk mail. I know it doesn't make the mailers happy, but have you looked at anything like that for the Postal Service going forward? Is that the new model? Should we be preparing for that?
I particularly do not have much knowledge of ZoomBox, but I know there are folks who are studying it within the Postal Service. We're always looking for new products to bring out to the market. I think on the panel we heard earlier about the summer sale. We've also introduced a flat rate box and an advertising campaign around the flat rate box, which has been a huge success so far this summer. So we're always looking at new products to be able to go to market with to enhance our situation.
Thank you. My time has expired. I'm going to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I've only got two brief questions. Let me ask you, Mr. Small, does this plan, that is the facilities postal station reorganization, will it necessitate or cause any layoffs?
This effort by itself, no.
And so attrition would basically take care of those individuals who would have to go, and then there would be an opportunity to shift other employees to other facilities.
The employees would be moved in compliance with our collective bargaining agreements.
The other question that I have is actually for Mr. Saracel. Mr. Saracel, you know, I know that we're always trying to make sure that we take into consideration the needs of as many stakeholders as we possibly can. And it seems as though if we get backed up against the wall, you don't have any choice. You got to decide something. If your members and associates were to decide what hurt them the most, would it be 5-day delivery or would it be reorganization of stations?
5-day delivery, with those two, 5-day delivery would hurt more of my members than the reorganization of the stations.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich, for 5 minutes.
To Mr. Small, welcome. We had the opportunity to work together in Cleveland years ago, and I appreciated that, and I appreciate your commitment to the Postal Service. So don't take personally any of the questions I'm about to ask you. How does the Postal Service ensure community participation in the decision-making process?
For the station and branch consolidation effort?
Could you pull that mic a little closer?
For the station and branch consolidation effort, we have basically 3 different means of which we communicate with the public, depending on the size of the community. We either send a questionnaire seeking their input to their residents, or we post at the local office, local station for a period of time seeking their input. All P.O. box holders get a hard copy form within their P.O. box soliciting their feedback, and we also will post community notices within newspapers for 5 days to seek the community input. Part of the process, and we encourage, is community meetings.
Well, let's talk about the community meetings. do you have any knowledge of how many community meetings you may have held in, let's say, 44111?
No, I don't have that information. I'll surely provide it to you.
I haven't heard of any, and I know there's talk of consolidation there. And so I think it's important to have community meetings, but community meetings where, excuse me, would you shut that door? We're going around or whatever you're going to do. Would you be able to let this committee know what kind of community meetings you're talking about? I mean, do you actually send a letter to everybody in a certain zip code saying, we're going to have a meeting at the Gallagher Post Office to talk about postal consolidation, and here's what it could mean to the community, and we want your input. Here's the time and the place. I'm not aware of meetings like that. And I think that considering the gravity of this, you owe it to your customers to do something to be no less than that.
I would be happy to provide the committee with a copy of the template that we send to the local districts for dissemination to the community. Of course, each community is different and the makeup is different, so we asked the local offices to just use that as a template and tailor the feedback, the surveys, and the way they conduct the community meetings to their own community's needs.
Thank you, Mr. Small, but that's theoretical. You haven't really given me a practical explication or explanation of how this works in reality. I'd like to have that with respect to Cleveland-Cuyahoga County so we can get into the nitty-gritty about what you've sought in terms of public input. I look at this, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Here's my concern. My concern is that you are actually dismantling a service infrastructure. Thousands and thousands of mailboxes out. No one asked me about that. I'm a member of this committee. I don't know how many other members were asked about that. Just take mailboxes out of communities. Gone. Now, if you're into marketing, it seems you want to show the flag somewhere. How does taking mailboxes out help a service delivery? And then you're talking about closing branches. So how does that help with service delivery if we're talking about universal service? What I see happening is, and even in Maine Post Office, there are services that are being switched off. So what I see happening here, you can make your economic justification, fine. But what I see happening is a dismantling, a slow and steady dismantling of the infrastructure of the United States Postal Service, starting with mailboxes in neighborhoods, postal branches, changes at branch offices, changes at airport post offices across this country. And you're actually doing that piecemeal and, right under the nose of Congress because you waive the dollar bill, we don't, have enough money. And, oh, is that right? That passes for anything over here. And that's a shortcut to debate here. I don't think you're going to be able to answer this question, but I'll just conclude, Mr. Chairman, by saying that there's a stench of privatization about this whole thing. And I'm not going to diminish the service of you, Mr. Small, or anybody else in the United States Postal Service. But there's another game going on here that really is about taking this public wealth of a universal postal service and carving it up and handing it out to special interests. And I see the slow and steady dismantling of the postal infrastructure as being an inexorable move in that direction. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the District of Columbia for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I have just one more question I have since, and I thank you for getting this list to me, and I'm not objecting to the list, as I said before. Indeed, I think I have some understanding, but I'm not sure I do. And remember, my concern is the slow walk to collapse. I certainly appreciate the need for study. I do think one has to be careful to look at all the factors. I'm having a hard time understanding why we're just studying some of these matters, such as the station branches identified, quote, for full study. Going back to what I said to Mr. Herr, like they got taken off of the high-risk list, I don't think that was the service to them, frankly. I think they need to see the handwriting on the wall before their eyes as much as possible. And I don't, as tough as the GAO normally is, can't imagine the fact that there's been some tiny baby steps taken here, should have removed them. But Mr. Small, I need to know now, I know from your testimony at page 5, what you will be looking at, considering such factors as customer access, service standards, cost savings, impact on employees, environmental impact, real estate values. All of this makes sense. What I don't know from your testimony is how you chose the particular stations or branches to look at for those factors in the first place.
Okay, I'd be happy to explain. As mentioned in Mr. Waller's testimony, he talked about EAS 24 and above offices. So let me explain what an EAS 24 and above office is. An EAS 24 is the lowest level potential office we're looking at. Typically, EAS 24 has a post office where a postmaster is resident and the chief administrator for postal services, as well as subordinate stations. Generally at 24, there may be 3 or 4 stations. As you get larger through 26 and then to a PCs, what we call PCs, post offices, such as Miami, where you have 50 stations. So we're looking at large groups of stations where you have offices that are in close proximity to each other, that mailers' habits and consumers' habits have told us that they no longer go to the retail unit, that there's been a decline in retail activity, and that there's been an increase.
So will these tend to be smaller stations or branches?
I'm sorry?
Will these tend to be smaller stations or branches?
They could be larger, depending on whether they have adequate space to absorb a neighboring station which is in close proximity. They could be 2 smaller stations where one has adequate workroom floor space to consolidate.
Go ahead, sir.
We won't know until a complete and thorough review is performed on all those offices on the list we've provided.
Now, you say, again, on page 5, we do not anticipate this review process to generate any changes this fiscal year, which ends September 30th. When did this begin, this study begin?
It began in approximately May.
Well, Mr. Chairman, this is what I mean. I really don't think this is rocket science. And the notion that we're beginning in May to look at what offices are too close to one another or may have to consolidate is what I mean by slow walking the Postal Service to collapse. And what I mean about facing the right sizing model earlier rather than later. And Mr. Herr, that's what I mean when I say you can take them off the list all you want to, but I can't imagine why they haven't been on the high-risk list for 10 years. And I don't think dumbing down the list by taking them off, and that's what it does as far as I'm concerned, to say that something in the extreme position of the Postal Service that we've seen now for years has not been at high risk makes me wonder what in the world is at a high risk. I can think of no major entity in the United States at higher risk than the United States Postal Service? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Well, I think this panel has suffered enough, and I want to thank you, seriously, I want to thank you for your willingness to come before the committee to help us with our work. And there are, as always, there are several hearings going on at the same time, so I would just caution you that there may be members who would like to submit questions in writing, and if that is the case, I would ask you to respond within 7 days, if you could. Thank you very much. Have a good day. At this time, I would like to welcome our third panel. I know we are expecting votes around 12:30, so we might be able to get everyone seated and begin with introductions at least. Thank you.
Committee for their action on H.R. 22. I hope in the near future the House will be able to quickly move retiree health benefit legislation. And finally, I would like to reiterate our commitment to continuing to make mail operations as efficient as possible while maintaining our excellent levels of service to the nation. Thank you, and I would be pleased to respond to your questions.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Waller, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lynch, Ranking Member Chavis, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on plans to adjust the retail and delivery networks.
Can I ask you to please pull that microphone a little
Sure.
closer to you? Yeah.
On July 2nd, the Postal Service requested a Commission advisory opinion on Postal Service station and branch optimization and consolidation initiative, the subject of this hearing. Docket N 2009-1 was quickly established and the public notified through the Federal Register, the Internet, and press releases. This morning, the Commission held a conference with persons interested in this consolidation to identify expectations for the docket and all procedural concerns. With this input, the Commission will shortly establish the agenda for examining the initiative and addressing all the issues. To ensure a wide range of public input, the Commission is considering holding hearings outside of the Washington, D.C. area. Now, what the Commission is being asked to do is determine if this consolidation initiative will generate changes in the nature of Postal Service on a nationwide basis.
Mr. Jerry Sarasal is Senior Vice President of the Government Affairs for the Direct Marketing Association. Mr. Arthur Sackler is the Executive Director of the National Postal Policy Council, and Mr. Michael Murphy is President of the Japs Olson Company, a printing and logistics company in St. Louis Park, Minnesota. Thank you all for your willingness to come forward and help the committee with its work. I now recognize Mr. Small for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I am here to talk to you about the steps the United States Postal Service has taken to make mail delivery as efficient as possible, our future operational plans to continue to improve delivery efficiency, and the Station and Branch Optimization Initiative. As you are well aware, the financial situation of the Postal Service is grave. It would be far worse were it not for the aggressive actions we have implemented. For example, since 2002, we have reduced costs by more than $1 billion annually. These efforts are particularly impressive when you consider that our delivery network continues to grow at a rate of about 1.2 new delivery points each year. In effect, we are delivering less mail to more addresses, which means we receive less revenue per address served. Cutting costs in delivery is particularly challenging because a substantial portion of delivery costs are fixed. Our carriers must deliver to each address whether there is one piece of mail or several. Within these constraints, we've embarked upon several initiatives that have improved delivery efficiency. The first initiative is the historic interim alternate route adjustment process that we have agreed to with the National Association of Letter Carriers, NALC, in 2008. This agreement enabled us to jointly conduct evaluations on some 93,000 routes and rapidly eliminate approximately 2,500 routes. Realizing that additional process improvements could be made, both parties jointly agreed to a new modified agreement in April 2009. The cost savings are estimated to eliminate approximately 25 million city delivery work hours, or some $1 billion over fiscal years 2009 and 2010. One consolidation activity that is underway is the review of station and branch locations in larger cities where we have a number of offices in close proximity. We began the review with some 3,200 locations that handled the most retail transactions and the most deliveries. We anticipate that out of these 3,200 locations, less than 1,000 will be considered as viable candidates to study further. Changes in mail processing technology have reduced the amount of space needed for carrier operations at many stations and branches. As a consequence, opportunities exist to consolidate carrier operations into fewer locations without affecting service. Many stations and branches were established at a time when first-class mail volume growth was robust. There were few means of alternate access to postal services, and virtually all retail revenue came from window transactions. Today, about 29% of retail revenue is generated through alternate access channels, such as our website, USPS.com, and automated postal centers. As local management undertakes the station and branch review, they will consider factors such as customer access, service standards, cost savings, impact on employees, environmental impact, real estate values, and long-term postal needs. We are taking all of these actions to use our resources wisely and position the Postal Service to survive this financial crisis while continuing top-quality service to the American public. Along this line, I ask Congress to support the Postal Service efforts to operate in a business-like manner as we make necessary decisions. As you know, the Postal Service has alerted stakeholders that mail volume levels can no longer sustain 6-day-a-week delivery. In prior testimony, the Postmaster General asked Congress to consider allowing a change in delivery frequency. At the same time, the Postmaster General tasked Postal Management with undertaking an internal review of 5-day delivery, so we have sufficient information and data to share with stakeholders. We are in the process of finalizing our study and have targeted the next months to share the results with our stakeholders and to begin a series of community outreach meetings. We plan to share this study with employees, customers, mailers, and members of Congress. Moreover, we will be asking the Postal Regulatory Commission for an advisory opinion. In closing, I would like to thank this subcommittee and the Oversight and Government Reform
Good morning. It is the customary practice of this committee to swear all witnesses who are to provide testimony. Can I please ask you to rise and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give to this subcommittee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect that all of the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. As you may notice, there's two small boxes in front of you. The practice here is to allow each witness 5 minutes. It'll show a green light while your testimony is being given. When that light turns yellow, it means you've got 1 minute to wrap up, and when it shows red, it requires you to stop speaking. What I'd like to do is just offer a brief introduction of our second panel of witnesses. Mr. Jordan Small is Acting Vice President, Network Operations for the United States Postal Service. Mr. John Waller is Director of the Office of Accountability and Compliance at the Postal Regulatory Commission. Mr. Philip Hare is Director of Physical Infrastructure Issues at the Government Accountability Office.